Well, we are at the top of the hour. I want to say good morning and good evening to our global audience coming in and around Washington, D.C. It's the eighth annual Wow or Yow or Holy Cow FDA in review and look ahead. As usual, we have a preeminent panel, but an unusually long list of hot topics to cover, many in the holy cow category. And by the way, Tim Franson gave us that technical term, which I think is very apt. But Thomas, over to you for some housekeeping notes.
Thanks, Sam. A housekeeping reminder to enter any questions for the speakers in the Q&A function of our Zoom webinar platform, and the panelists will try to get to them as time allows. As usual, a link of this recording will be circulated to all registrants and made publicly available within the next day or two. A distinctive feature of our virtual conference sessions is that we enable the chat function for audience interaction. So just for warm up, for those of you who are willing, please say hi in the chat, your affiliation if desired, and from where you're logged in. I'm now turning the mic over to Connexum founder and executive chairman, Dr. Alexander Fleming. Zan?
Well, thanks, Thomas. We are so honored to have join us Dr. Janet Woodcock, who perhaps more than any single person has shaped therapeutic review and regulation at FDA over close to 4 decades. And no one could get us started better with Janet than Frank Sasanowski, who's the Dean of Rare Disease Therapeutic Development and a master strategist across multiple therapeutic areas. So Frank, I'm going to turn it over to you to get us started with Janet.
Thanks, Sam. And it's just a pleasure to welcome you, Janet, to this panel. We've been doing this under Zan's leadership for 8 years now. This is our 8th. And obviously, because last year at this time, you were still at the government. And so we call it the Wow or Yow. And I'd have to say it's a tremendous yow that on January 26, 2024, we lost you. You know, you after nearly 4 decades, kind of chose, your opportunity to have these kind of fireside chats, and I thank you for having the fireplace behind you so we can get started. So when Bob Temple, our common friend, good friend, retired in December, the BioCentury headline said, "Father of the modern FDA." I think that they should have said that when you retired, you were the mother of the modern FDA. I don't know what Roger or Bonnie would think about the two of you being the mother and the father, but I think you are the mother of the modern FDA. So thank you for being here with us. First question is that not long after you retired, you gave me a call, said, "Frank, I'm calling you from the matriarchy." I said, "What's that?" You said, "I'm calling from Santa Fe, New Mexico, a high-end resort. I'm meeting with the women CEOs of biotech, and we have a question about, rare disease pathway." And so I'd like you to talk a little bit about one of the first things I heard you get engaged with, after your retirement.
Thanks, Frank, and happy to do so. Yes, I'm working on trying to get another variation to the way that you can show substantial evidence. And I thank Dave Fox, who's on this panel, for his intellectual contributions to this, because they were substantial. We have had over the years, first we had 2 adequate and well-controlled trials, and that's what Bob spent 20 years establishing in the courts and so forth, and P less than 0.05 and all this kind of stuff. And that was really good. That was a triumph because we had evidence-based drugs getting on the market. But then we had the AIDS crisis. FDA kind of invented accelerated approval. They had numerous large trials with a survival advantage, and you can't really, are we going to enroll people in a placebo and do a second trial? Okay, when we showed that, and so we had single trial plus confirmatory evidence. So that was another variation along with accelerated approval. And then when, bioterrorism became a big concern, we had the animal rule, which FDA published. The first 2 Congress instantiated eventually in statute. The other one is a rule, the animal rule, whereby FDA can approve things based on animal model studies when human studies aren't feasible. Now, what turns out, though, is, the a randomized controlled trial is not fit for purpose for small heterogeneous populations. And we've seen this over and over again. And we've seen that about maybe 1,400 rare disease programs have been paused in the last few years because there is no feasible way forward. So the variation I'm seeking is that for smaller populations, heterogeneous populations in particular, where the RCT isn't feasible, other trial designs should be acceptable. And you might say, and I'll stop talking soon, but you might say, well, FDA's already done this. That is true. All right, but it's inconsistent, it's not predictable, and so it isn't as if you can rely upon that and go forward and design a program. And frankly, between the agency and companies, they spend years struggling over how to design a RCT type of trial. And what they should be doing is sitting down and talking, how can we generate convincing evidence? How can we do that? And I have ideas, of course, always have ideas about trial designs that would do that. So I'm working on that. I'm working with the Haystack Project, and we're going to have a technical workshop just on the design issues in a couple of weeks and hopefully move forward. So thanks for asking.
No, thank you, because that's an area I've been working on too in my career. So I just welcome, having your kind of voice in this process, and because you have a voice that has a lot of influence. You speak with great authority. And so it's I can be a voice crying in the wilderness, but it's good to have you on board and moving this forward. So thank
Well,
you.
Frank, I think it's a technical problem, and we need to move it from advocacy problem to as technically these RCT doesn't work. The p-value less than 0.5, you have to have a miracle, okay? If you have 60 people to randomize who are heterogeneous, you'd have to have a miracle to have a p less than a miracle drug. But for headaches or for all kind of stuff, you can roll a lot of people and have only maybe 10% of the people benefit, and it's effective, right? But for rare diseases, you have to practically have a cure. Is this fair when these are the people who are suffering so badly, many of them? So I'll stop there.
No, but that's beautiful. I'd love to have you go on for the whole bit, but let's, you also you've been called the Renaissance woman because you've been involved with so many things inside the FDA. Like, let's move to what about, your role in improving pharmaceutical manufacturing? Where do you see that?
Yes, I'm still working on that. I'm working with Anders Winther, and he's been putting on quality business leadership training over in Dublin, and this is going pretty well. I think to move the quality people up, I'm also, and I can't necessarily talk about it, but I've decided that big pharma and the generics, neither of them are going to push on advanced manufacturing. So I want to work with the contract manufacturers because will have a clear vision that this is a competitive advantage, right? If they can do it right. So yeah, I'm still working on this because, people talk about bringing manufacturing back to the United States, having more redundancy and everything, but what are we doing about it? And I would think the only way you could really do that and bring manufacturing back and actually put it different places is to use different manufacturing techniques than what is commonly used today.
Yeah, no, thank you, Janet, for all that work. So what else have you been up to? Yeah.
Well, I don't want to dominate.
I don't want to talk about your gardening. No.
Okay. Or my orchids,
Yeah, no, don't go there.
Okay. Well, I am working on a project with RA Capital up in Boston and it's partly for rare diseases, but not totally. What it is trying to get an AI driven diagnostic interview for patients that would give them a differential diagnosis linked to patient advocacy organizations of diseases that they might have, linked to resources, tell them, what kind of tests and workup they should have, because so many people are misdiagnosed, not just with rare diseases, but common diseases. But what is missing in my mind is the link between the patient and their lived experience and what goes in the chart, a medical lingo. And there's this giant gap there. And so the AI have a lot of translation functions, but we've never trained AI on how patients talk about their disease. So that's what I'm going to do, or I'm doing.
No, that's fascinating. Hey, Zan, I think that we were going to have this little introductory fireside chat just
Yeah.
to get us going. So why don't I
Well,
turn it back over to you? Yeah.
Well, thanks, Frank.
Thank
That
you,
was
Zan.
great. I love that dialogue. And we're going to come back to Janet for some selected topics a little bit later. But why don't we now go to Stephen Grossman, who has been what I would call the FDA advocate in chief in his very effective role as executive director of the Alliance for a Stronger FDA. And Stephen was just feted last night to thank him for that service. But Stephen has left very important fingerprints on a lot of things FDA, although he never served in the agency. But for example, was involved with the Orphan Drug Act back in the early 80s. So Stephen brings a terrific perch. And Stephen, glad you could rejoin the panel this year.
You're on
Oops.
mute.
Okay, I did want to
There you go.
correct one thing. I did work at HHS. I was in the level above FDA, and I learned how little they wanted to be controlled by downtown DC.
Well,
So for everybody who served at the agency, that should resonate. That's really my first taste was there and then, and made a lot of good friends, learned a lot in the process of trying to avoid FDA evasion from the Assistant Secretary for Health. I think the part I've been assigned is to look at some of the institutional issues. Transitions are always a difficult time, and it's true whether it's a friendly transfer or an unfriendly transfer. And I and several of the people like Janet have seen both. But every new administration, even if the prior administration was of the same party, want to put their own mark on things. And that's what we're seeing. And the cases, if you go back to each of the change of control elections, change of president, you see a degree of uncertainty that starts with, somewhere in December usually, and continues at least through May. Historically, the last two people who were nominated at the beginning of a new administration their names were announced in early March and they were confirmed in May. So my choice of say June 1 is not entirely arbitrary. This administration got started by naming someone much earlier. But as far as I can tell from people, late February, early March is probably the likelihood for a confirmation hearing. And so maybe we'll see a commissioner closer to April 1 than in the past. Meantime, we have a massive number of executive orders and other things that are affecting FDA. I made this point a little earlier with a much smaller organization's audience, so I'll make it again. There is no question that the sum of all these executive orders is to dispirit the federal government workforce and to encourage people to retire, leave service. In some cases, that might be premature. In other cases, it may be the number I saw, and Janet probably knows a better number, is that about 15% of the FDA workforce is retirement eligible. And when you look at how people are going to make decisions, there's a huge difference between I wasn't expecting to retire today, and I'm not sure what I do next, and being retirement eligible. So that if you figure because I know we'll get back to brain drain, but if you just do the math, say a 1/4 take up on retirement eligible people, that's probably about 1,000 positions right there before you get to all the other stuff. The larger point is that because FDA has multiple personnel systems, multiple sources of revenue, a much larger range of job positions than most agencies, as we're getting each of these top-down announcements about retirements, about return to work, they all apply in general to FDA, but you should not assume immediately that they have the same impact as either was intended or the same impact as they might have on some other agency because of the different personnel systems. As some of you have lived through shutdowns know, for instance, the only FDA employees that you know work through a shutdown are the Public Health Service Corps members because they technically are presidential appointments and not personnel. So that's just an example. That's not necessarily what's happening today so much as an example of how the variation is so great. I was asked to address a couple of institutional issues. One is that I've started a new newsletter called FDA Matters, and one of the columns was called Keep Calm and Carry On, a title I owe to Zan, thank you. And I think that's the most important advice right now. No one does really know what's going to happen a month, 6 months from now. And people should not let their imagination run wild. FDA has survived a lot of changes, a lot of turmoil. It's not good. I'm not arguing for turmoil, but it is also the case that it is an agency that does survive. And it's in all of our interests that people not jump to conclusions and that people not decide before they know what's really going to happen. It's one thing to worry about the management you're going to have. It's quite another to wait and see because that often does work out. And this, interestingly enough, was also advice that Dr. Califf was giving people. So to me, the standard becomes, these are going to be hard times in a lot of ways, and the agency is going to survive. And I think the main thing is for all of us to be sure that the people stay together because FDA is the people. It's, when everybody goes home, there isn't really much going on compared to other operations. So that's one point that I want to make. As a threshold, just take a deep breath, or as Zan said, keep calm and carry on. A couple of other things I was asked about to comment on was the McCary confirmation, and especially as we're in the midst of the Kennedy confirmation hearings, I can just give my view on the McCary one, which is he's qualified. If you look back over, and I'm now on my 13th or 14th commissioner, I think I'm even ahead of Janet on that one, but probably not ahead of Frank. Everybody brings a different style. Everybody brings different strengths. He's well within the range of people who held the office. I think for most of us, the most important question is, and maybe we'll know a little more confirmation, is whether he's going to be willing to stand up to orders that are not necessarily in the best interests of the public, not necessarily in the interests of FDA, that may be anti-science. And I think it's safe to say every commissioner, regardless of who they are, who their boss is, faces this. And somebody at the reception last night made an interesting observation. I said, well, that's the key question. Is he going to stand up and say no? And their response was, even he probably doesn't actually know yet. And that's consistent with my experience and each of us who's had a role in government, which is a lot of things you think about and you say, well, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. When the moment comes, and so I think we'll know more after the confirmation, but the moment of truth really comes after that. Two other things, the resources constraints on the agency are already not good. It's not just, is there money to pay for personnel, but there's dire need for new computer systems, new IT, AI, there's a lot of talk about AI in terms of applications and companies. But one of the most important issues for FDA is how can they use AI to make better regulatory decisions? And at least at the moment, I don't think there's any money for that, and that needs to be. And then there's the larger struggle, which is Congress is going to be looking at a lot of across the board cuts where individual agencies of mission and importance are not going to be examined each agency. And that's an important thing. My successor at the Alliance for Stronger FDA, Cara Esham, is wonderful, and she's going to be one of the point people on making sure Congress understands that FDA is different and needs different treatment. And then finally, the last thought I had was on making making Americans healthy again. And the reason I think it's important is you've heard Janet reference, we're all always aware there's always a struggle to find the right standards for approvals. And food, of course, operates very differently, but I think we all need to see that this is going to be as profound a battle for the food industry and for food stakeholders and for each of us as Americans as what it is constitutes to take a drug, to have a drug approved, and that it's going to draw all of us in. I think that's good. There's lots of questions that need exploring. I think there's going to be a lot of uncomfortable stuff. I do think that in its own way, it's going to be a bigger deal because food is more personal and it's more relatable for people. And you're going to have people who would never dare to have an opinion about drug approvals who are going to have an opinion about MAHA. So anyway, that's just some institutional thoughts.
Well, terrific, Stephen. And we will come back to Janet to talk about food because that became a passion of hers in her latter tenure at FDA. And so she will definitely be able to speak to us about issues there. But let's now go to Kate Rawson, who is, I believe, one of the most effective journalists of FDA matters and incisive in her approach to the issues at FDA. With her broad perch, she can certainly cover a lot of FDA territory. So, Kate, let's start with your first thoughts.
Yeah. Dan, thank you so much. And I'll make some brief remarks. And then I think I saw Janet coming off mute, so I'm sure she's going to have some things to respond to as well. So we could talk all day about this transition, but I'm going to try to keep my remarks really succinct and build off of what Steve has already said. And I agree, the sky is not falling, but it looks kind of dark out there, I gotta say. We've had this triple punch of the communications freeze, the mass retirement offer, and the return to work directive that really sent, based on conversations that we've had with folks, the agency staff into a bit of a tailspin this week. And that's really not an overstatement. That retirement offer, which was entitled A Fork in the Road, which I sort of smiled at, was emailed to everybody, as we know, at FDA and all federal agencies, with some exceptions. And the directive was just to simply respond with resign in the subject line. They would then be exempt from these return to work directives that I think take effect on February 20th, and not work, but in most cases, continue to be paid through September 30th. I think the legality and the attractiveness of that buyout plan is still not clear. Like Steve said, there's a lot we don't know. I think the broader point, obviously, is that the Trump team is following through on its plans to significantly reduce the size of the federal workforce. That's not terrible, right? Except, I'd add that offer went out to everybody, including senior leadership, and including people that you wouldn't necessarily want to leave FDA because it would be so disruptive. And just as a reminder, I know brain drain has been thrown around a little bit. I know everybody was worried that the sky was falling, Janet, when you retired. We've already seen some other high profile recent departures, some that probably were not related to the incoming administration, and others that feel like they probably were, like our former CEDAR director, Patrizia Cavazzoni. You know, on top of that, the administration is also looking, and this is what we're watching, is looking to target other people that maybe the administration doesn't believe supports President Trump's personal views on issues like vaccines or abortions. He in that one of the many executive orders that came down on the 20th, he stripped employee protections for, I've seen estimates of at least 50,000 career employees that would effectively make them at-will employees. That plan has already been, challenged in court, so it may not hold up. But I think it does, as we said in our intro, when we were making our intro remarks, that it casts a pall over the agency. And that was probably the point from the beginning. It's also hard when and Janet made this point when we were sort of chatting informally, when you can't send an all hands memo or talk to your staff in a group as a group, that's hard. That's hard for leaders. That's hard for reviewers. That's hard for the staff. At the same time, as a reporter, I can't help but notice that there have been no real press releases coming out of FDA since Inauguration Day, with some exceptions. And to be clear, the work is continuing, right? I mean, we're seeing approvals being announced by industry, although I can only imagine how distracted the staff has been during this time. But FDA has not been allowed to publish press releases or update websites. I think that the good news is that freeze appears to be starting to thaw. There was a press release yesterday about a non-opioid pain medicine from Vertex, and there were other releases today that weren't as high profile. So it makes one think that maybe things are starting to open up. But at the same time, we're seeing a systematic takedown of any websites or programs that remotely address DEI issues. FDA Office of Minority Health is down. The Oncology Center for Excellence's Project Equity program is down. Any guidance related to clinical trial diversity, including all the work that industry and agency staff have put into diversity action plans. So a generous reading of this, right, is that the administration is just reviewing all that DEI work and will reinstate some of the programs. We'll see. Again, we don't know. But I would submit that there are two big questions related to the DEI shutdown. And the one is that that requirement for diversity action plans was codified in law under FDORA. So I'm sure if there hasn't been already litigation over whether the administration can simply decline to publish the final guidance called for in the statute. But I would also submit that this situation is very challenging for biopharma sponsors who for the past 4 years have been working on DEI, have been encouraged to open DEI offices, and have been submitting diversity action plans in recent months to the agency to get out ahead of this and to understand what the requirements are going to be. I think, President Trump has clearly said that he hopes that companies will follow his anti-woke agenda against DEI, and that could complicate things for industry because, as a practical matter, drug developers still need to address questions or concerns about diversity of clinical trial populations. They need to enroll a diverse patient population to both represent where the disease is most prevalent and understand potential signals of different responses in different subgroups. So there are some potential implications for the future of clinical trials in general, not ones that are running right now, obviously, but ones that could be planned. And that's something that we tend to, that we certainly think that we'll be continuing to follow. Interestingly, in his confirmation hearing this week, RFK Jr. did pledge to continue work on the diversity action plans as mandated by Congress. I assume he understood that question. There was some confusion during that exchange as to whether he knew what they were, and he might not. Just as the HHS nominee, you're not going to know everything about everything. But he did make that commitment, at least in I think it was the Senate Finance Committee hearing. So the other thing I was asked to talk about was just I do want to share some observations from the nominations hearings this week for RFK Jr. There were back-to-back hearings in the Senate Finance and in the Help Committees, and they really did underscore a definite sort of anti-pharma and sometimes anti-FDA sentiment from our potential HHS secretary. So I think just really briefly, a couple of key themes. Over medication comments that were made by the nominee are a risk for pharma. He repeatedly stated that this claim that pharmaceutical drugs are the third largest cause of death in the US. And I think, we think the risk there is that his views on over medication will soon be sort of orthodoxy in the Republican Party in the same way that once these sort of fringe anti-vaccine views have now been moved into the mainstream. He did sow some doubts about specific drug classes. He specifically targeted antidepressants, for example, as being overprescribed and dangerous. And then we saw a tweet from Elon Musk to that effect as well. He's called into question Alzheimer's disease research based on the amyloid plaque reduction work there. We saw not a lot of moderation in his vaccine views. It felt like maybe the older vaccines were safe, but he repeatedly declined to say that the MMR vaccine does not cause autism. He defended the position that the HPV vaccine, Gardasil, leads to an increase in the risk of cervical cancer. He questioned whether COVID vaccines save lives, and he described HHS's network of vaccine surveillance programs as hopelessly flawed. And then he also did, on the other hand, appear to support some specific interventions like the GLP-1s, appeared to generally support their use in obesity with some caveats, and then also supported medically assisted treatment for opioid use disorder. So those were sort of our takeaways from about 6 hours of testimony this week. I'm going to pause there. I have some other topics that I've been assigned, but I'd love to hear any responses from what has been said already, or we can move on to other topics.
And Kate, we'll give you a few seconds to end on what you would see as a bright spot, maybe
Okay,
cell
great.
and gene therapies.
Yeah, no, I think cell and gene therapy is an exciting area of development. I think if CBER and OTP can kind of keep its head down, there's a lot of great stuff down the road for cell and gene therapy development. I think with all the COVID work obviously now behind it, CBER is, there may be some critiques that they're going to have to deal with, but CBER seems to be firing on all cylinders now with cell and gene therapies. I think Peter Marks, as the director of CBER, is enthusiastic about using accelerated approval for gene therapies to speed up development. There's a near-term promise of using AI to take out the bumps in gene editing, in the gene editing manufacturing process. We've had 3 regenerative therapy approvals in 2024 and just 2 in December, which sort of plow this nice path for future development. And hopefully, I hope that enthusiasm around cell and gene therapy development will keep OTPers engaged and in their seats. And I think still to be determined, and I'd love to hear what Frank thinks about this, and Janet too, the impact of the 2-headed CBER-CDER rare disease hub, especially without a permanent CDER director at the moment. But exciting times ahead for cell and gene therapy, for sure.
Well, terrific. We'll come back to that in a moment, but let's go on to Tim Franson. And many thanks, Kate. That was wonderful. Terrific summary. Tim Franson, master drug developer, formerly at Lilly, an infectious disease specialist, and a professional punster who often adds to our humor in this session. Tim, let's start with issues related to pediatric trials and what you have termed pediatric trials and tribulations. Take it away.
Thanks, Ann. And it's a real privilege to be on a panel with folks that I respect and have enjoyed collaborating with over the decades. As it relates to pediatrics, it's said that the humanity of a culture can be judged on how they treat their most vulnerable, especially children. And one would have to challenge at this point whether we're doing enough for the best health interests for our youngest constituents and what that means for the future. So let's talk about the practicalities. If you fast rewind to where we were with PDUFA 2 and the provisions for pediatric exclusivity, at that point in time, development of compounds for children were very minimal. And without those incentives, we were seeing up to 90% of, for example, oncolytic drugs that were not labeled for pediatric use. Those are not flattering figures. It's not scientifically driven. And as a result of those incentives with BPCA and PRIA and incentives for pediatric drug development, there have been several studies that talk about 300 to 400 compounds that have now been labeled for pediatric use. That's an incredibly good news story. It's appropriate in many ways for not only practitioners, but policymakers. But let's now look at the more recent circumstances where a number of pediatric research centers have been either closed or minimized, Tufts being a particular example in that regard. The training of pediatric investigators for clinical trials has been truncated. Several major pharmaceutical companies have closed their pediatric trial groups, and those are not encouraging when you look at the fact that the need for pediatric therapeutics, especially for acute diseases, we've done a huge shift to chronic with adults, but the great threats to our pediatric population come frequently from acute diseases, and nowhere has that been more evident than with infectious disorders. Speaking as an infectious disease physician and as a grandfather, I'm convinced that we need to have new incentives as FDA has de-emphasized the BPCA provisions and incentives, and perhaps that's appropriate. They may be outdated, and we should be revisiting the ways to catalyze drug development for pediatrics at these points in time. But I would submit that our children in America are disadvantaged immunologically because especially as in neonatal populations, they don't have mature immune systems. Societally, there are a number of things that conspire, such as food insufficiency and a significantly large minority of children's populations. So we're essentially setting kids up for the likelihood of not responding well to infectious disorders. And that culminates with the recent vaccine declines. And we can speculate about the political reasons, but I would argue the medical are much more important. We're now seeing recurrences of diseases such as whooping cough and measles, which are certainly highly contagious. There are reasonable treatments for whooping cough, Bordetella pertussis, but not so much for measles. And some of us who trained in environments around communities that had religious preclusions on vaccine use have seen the natural experiment of what happens when you aren't immunized against measles. Blindness, loss of hearing, encephalitis, not very pleasant things. And when you talk about that being totally preventable, this becomes very worrisome because the public has an eroding confidence in science, in vaccines, and those things are quite distressing when you think that this disadvantages the young and it's entirely inconsistent with our scientific base. So sorry, I don't have anything humorous or punny to offer in those areas, but I do think that we should take a note of positive in that there have been no proposals to repeal the law of gravity, because without it, we'd have nothing to stand on. And then you had several other topics provided for me. I don't want to leave it without what can we do. There are a number of incentives I think we can reinstitute that will help us with pediatric drug development. I think the Pediatric Rare Disease Priority Review Voucher is a program that sits now in limbo. and is a great opportunity of being renewed if we all put our shoulder to the wheel on that. And I know we were going to talk about pandemic elements. Would you prefer I halt for a period, catch
Uh,
breath, and move
well,
on, or
well,
otherwise?
no, keep going. And you might get to accelerated disapproval, as you term it.
Sounds fun. I'll be brief on pandemics. If we look at the climate today from anti-infective risks, having come through the COVID crisis, and with great thanks to Janet and her colleagues for Operation Warp Speed, that was a great illustration of what can be done with appropriate surveillance globally. Uh, the collaboration with industry and regulators to deal with the crisis is remarkable and ought to be a case study all our young medical students and pharmacy students have as core curriculum. But we only need to turn around to say, with measles cropping up, what therapeutic would we propose using for that? Not anything available. We have our communications embargoed, so most people don't know that in the state of Kansas, one of the largest outbreaks of tuberculosis in America is now occurring with latent and active cases. That's also not very good for children to bridge back. Reports on congenital Zika having 14-fold greater mortality in children who come from mothers infected with Zika. We obviously don't have a good treatment idea for that. And we see outbreaks in distressing viral diseases in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, which appears to be a petri dish for things like Ebola and now an unidentified viral agent. So as we see a culmination of all this, what we need more than anything else is an early warning system, as we would for missiles. And quite frankly, these microbial missiles are coming in through the airways, airplanes, and other ways to our country. So if we aren't going to be in the WHO, we need some other way to early detect what kinds of things around the globe could be afflicting our populations in the near term. So not trying to be over amplifying these things, but those are really disconcerting developments, and we're not well prepared for any of those potential threats. And I would just close with, whether you believe in climate change or not, the mosquitoes are moving northward from the tropics and carrying wonderful things like chikungunya fever and dengue, also called bone break fever, which for those exposed to mosquitoes in our southern United States are experiencing those things. So I think we can do a much better job at detecting, anticipating, and preparing ourselves for those kind of infectious challenges. And I haven't even touched on antimicrobial resistance, which is a problem in war zone areas around the world, especially in children. So, quick comment about accelerated approval or disapproval. We all saw the report of the Office of Inspector General talking about 3 of the 24 accelerated approvals that they looked at having issues. And there are certainly issues with that. I have to look at it as, my goodness, 21 out of 24 compounds were actually positive. What we're doing is right. And you're talking about an over 80%, almost 90% success rate with that. I think we ought to be celebrating it, because we would probably do that with normal approvals, although our normal approval rate for lack of withdrawal, I think, is over 97%. So I think we ought be very careful about learning from outlier cases and celebrating the mainstream trends that are positive. So back to you, Zan.
Wow, Tim, what a powerful cri de coeur. It was just inspiring, though very sobering. And we need to be listening to you uh, more often. Or rather, you should be heard widely in all that you say. So, can't thank you enough for that great summary. Let's now go on to Kellyanne Payne, who is our guru for device and diagnostics and the master of CDRH in her practice at Hogan Lovells. So, Kellyanne, take it away. I know you're going to talk about guidances, both coming in and maybe going out.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm a little speechless after the last presentation, but with regard to devices, so my everyday today is with, the FDA reviewers, the directors of CDRH. And so kind of 2024 was a bit representative of 2023, number of submissions were pretty similar. I would say that there's more de novos. There was a little bit of an up jump in de novos submissions, and that could be debated as to why. A lot of people think FDA is getting a little more stringent in how they interpret intended use and indications for use, and that they have the de novo pathway now to clean up some of the product codes and putting devices that would have gone through the 510(k) pathway. And this has been going on, but there was a bit of an up jump in 2024 with de novo submissions, and so that's noted as to why that is. I think with guidances, so there's been a lot of talk on DEI, and while there's not been a huge direct effect in the device space, at least not yet, we are seeing some bumps in the road with withdrawing those guidances. Some people, a lot of their clinical utility of their device is based on reaching underrepresented populations. A lot of AI devices, are designed for that purpose, and having that, argument as some teeth as to their clinical utility has kind of, put a pause on, I would say, some submissions, some discussions with FDA on those device types, even breakthrough designation submissions, things of the like, until the dust settles and we see what gets reinstated or not reinstated. I think a lot of manufacturers are a bit shy to force those arguments and have those discussions with the agency at this point. So I think it's put a pause on some submissions in that sense. The AI guidances came out, a lot of, finalized guidances on AI. I don't see that changing, these finalized guidances as far as what goes into marketing submissions and life cycles, of AI devices. I think that will stay the course. I think those guidances simply put into place what we've been seeing from FDA for years, in interactions on these submissions with the agency. I actually have, some presentations that got put on hold with some organizations and things of the such because they think it may change. I just don't see that for the AI space, at least. I think FDA has been pretty good about starting to use the PCCP platform, which is the predetermined change control plans. I think when I spoke last year, there weren't as many. We're seeing more and more this year after FDA was kind of given the authority to get those through via the 510(k) pathways, and having these interactions and giving more transparency as to what those protocols should look like. So I think, that is kind of staying the course at FDA for now. I would say we see other things in the space. So cybersecurity is a big one for the device space these days, with the new requirements put in place in March 2023, I think it was. And we're starting to see the effects of that. So we're starting to see not substantially equivalent determinations and withdrawals of those submissions based on cyber issues alone. And so it's starting to raise questions as to what is a device, what is a component of a device, can FDA clear software development kits from a cybersecurity standpoint if we can't fully implement the cybersecurity testing required around those. So it's a kind of big one, and a lot of people's I would say, their plan and their business plan and their models are, getting a lot of these standalone software development kits through FDA. So that's a pause, and I think you're seeing a lot of the Digital Center of Excellence in these discussions coming forward and being asked to join these pre-submission interactions with the agency. We're also seeing fraudulent data issues on the agency side coming out of other countries, and FDA is flagging these on the pre-market side. So they're noticing trends when they get these submissions that manufacturers really don't have any insight to, because they're just assuming that this data coming from a lab that they paid for such data is appropriate. But what we're seeing and what the agency is seeing internally and communicating out is that these reports just look too similar. And so we're having to deal with fraudulent data issues and rerunning of testing and delaying submissions from that perspective. And so there are a lot of the issues we're seeing. LDTs remain up in the air. I don't know that anyone knows what's going to happen. I think the clock is ticking for some of the initial requirements. And I think, it's smart for companies to get prepared for that, at least for the initial few timelines that were laid out for LDTs. So I think that is for me kind of a summary of where they are on the device side. As far as resources, I would say where we see delays right now are on things like submission issue requests, right? Like there's a 21-day timeline for FDA to set up a meeting on some of those submission issue requests. And I would say that's where we're seeing the lag with resources, just getting medical officers in time to get on those meetings, or, the right technical expertise to attend those meetings in that time frame. Things like IDEs with the 30-day timeline, continue on course, and so do largely 510Ks, except for these ones with the fraudulent data, I would say. Once we pass the timeline of FDA's 90-day clock, it kind of goes on forever at that point, and there's no real timeline at that point for them to get back to us on a lot of these submissions. So happy to answer any questions, but the sky's not falling. I would say these are standard, issues we were seeing in years past as well.
Well, there have been changes in personnel, and yet things seem to be going well. What do you see as the overall functional capability of CDRH going forward?
I mean, like I said, I don't see any major changes. I think we thought it would take a bit of time to trickle down. I think the whole DEI thing kind of hit us a little more by surprise, just on the device side, and how it would impact just even sponsors deciding not to pursue certain submissions at this point in time. So I think just January, that was kind of where the flurry was for us, and just pulling back and coming up with strategies to maybe to get around and not put so much utility on kind of those DEI arguments, if you will. But other than that, for now, I don't see any major impacts. I can't say that they're not coming, but right now it's kind of business as usual.
All right. Well, very helpful, Kellyanne. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Why don't we go on now to Frank Sazanowski, whose real passion is rare disease, but you have your fingers in all kinds of things, Frank. So you don't have to just talk about rare disease, but the floor is now yours.
All right. Thanks, Ann. Thanks. I will start because Kate mentioned about cell and gene therapies, made a shout out as part of our WOW, for cell and gene therapies, that maybe we're at the tipping point. So let me just highlight a couple of those. Orchid Kiawahako Kirin got approval in March for Lenmeldy, a drug to treat metachromatic leukodystrophy. It's viewed as being the second curative gene therapy after Zolgensma for type 1 SMA. So it's really, it's a good illustration of what Kate's talking about, the power of gene therapy to be remarkably transformative. And I think we see that we continue to see that. CBER OTP under Peter Marks, Nicole Verdun, also approved a cell therapy, the first mesenchymal stem cell therapy, Ryoncil, for treating down to 2 months of age. Tim was talking about going to pediatrics. This cell therapy was approved for children as young as 2 months of old who have acute steroid-resistant graft-versus-host disease. So I think there haven't been that many cell therapies approved other than CAR T. So I think to really see OTP and CBER, start to have more traction on what have been more traditional kind of cell therapies, I think it's very encouraging to see cell and gene therapies. I think I agree with Kate, and she kind of asked me to speak out to this, so I'm leading off Kate with doing that. The next thing, Tim talked about de-accelerated, approvals. So I just want to talk about accelerated approvals for a second because of Tim's setup. And that is that I happened to be I was honored to be at the conference room, the commissioner's conference room table with Bob Temple when FDA created accelerated approval during the AIDS crisis. And, nobody today uses AZT. It's not part of triple HIV therapy. Janet Woodcock was the one who approved the first accelerated approval, not for cancer or AIDS, when she, in August 1993, approved beta-serin for MS. It was the first drug for MS. Look at how many different classes of MS drugs we now have, right? And then I had the privilege of being with Chris Garabedian and Sarepta, helping to get the first approval for the first Duchenne muscular dystrophy, DMD, eteplirsen, back in September 2016. And just this year, the FDA approved another drug for DMD, Duvisat for Ital Pharmaco. It's for any boy with DMD, regardless of their genetic defect. What am I getting at? look, the first drug that's approved under accelerated approval doesn't have to be perfect. They sell them on. But they open up. They open up. You know, academia then gets excited. An investment community starts to pour in, you know, and stuff. And then we see, look what happened to HIV. I mean, we went from a death sentence, were it not for the FDA coming up with accelerated approval, to now being a chronic disease. And MS, you know, beta serum, you know, Janet, that was a bold step by Janet to take back in August of 1993 to apply accelerated approval somewhere outside of cancer or AIDS. She did it. And look what happened to MS today. And look what's happened to DMD. A lot of people thought eteplirsen was kind of a controversial approval, but look what it's led to. Look at how many different therapies we have for DMD. So I just wanted to put a counterpoint to Tim's talking very correctly about de-accelerated approval. I'm still saying accelerated approval has a lot more utility for advancing public health than we kind of recognize. Lastly, I'll say that a lot of these very rare diseases that we thought could never be cured, Eric Parsegian, a famous Notre Dame football coach, had children who passed because of Niemann-Pick type C. So he started an advocacy and research center at Notre Dame. And this year, the FDA approved the first drug for Niemann-Pick type C, Miplyffa for Zevra. And what was interesting about that is that it was approved in September after an August 2nd advisory committee. The August 2nd advisory committee was really important because it was the first meeting of GEMDAC, which is the Genetic Metabolic Disease Advisory Committee. Now, Janet Woodcock happened to be at the Willard Hotel in September 2018 when I, at this Every Life scientific workshop, called for the creation of two things: a standing advisory committee for rare diseases and a rare disease center of excellence. And what we saw in the last year is, with the Rare Hub, the creation of something that's akin to the Rare Disease Center of Excellence. And Amy Rick is wonderful, great choice. And we saw this Genetic Metabolic Disease Advisory Committee created, which, again, it doesn't have the same title that I called for, the Rare Disease, you know, kind of standing advisory committee, but that's what it is. And so I'm seeing, what I'm saying is, to everybody out there, whether you're in academia, investment communities, industry, things take time.
Yeah.
When I first started talking about flexibility, because I saw how flexible FDA was in approving rare diseases back 25 years ago, and then I had to write a paper on it, and that now everybody knows about flexibility. Well, Janet is now talking, and Patricia Cavazzoni in her exit interview with BioCentury, she talked about ultra rare and how we need a new path. I've been talking about this for a few years too. We need another path. And so things take time. It's going to happen. It's going to happen. And thanks to the leadership of people like Janet Woodcock, she's a gift and a blessing for all of us. So
Wow.
I'll turn it back over to you, Zane.
Well, Frank, what a great segue to Janet. I, first of all, would say what a terrific summary that you just gave us, but it does lead to the opportunity for Janet to react to a number of things that have been said. And so, Janet, the floor is yours. I'm not going to try to direct you. I hope you'll mention foods, because that is something we like to cover and is very important to our country. But the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, first, I wanted to comment on something Steve said, because and something Kate mentioned, you know, if the appropriated base is necessary for the FDA user fee programs, and they're very close, most of them, except for the device one, to not having enough appropriations to manage that base. If that base isn't spent, then things go away. And so you could lose the programs if you did a cross-the-board, Kate, type of discretionary, federal discretionary budget cut, and FDA took a big hit because they just wouldn't have enough money. And so because those people are maybe 60, 70%, depending on the program, supported by user fees, that would be a major blow to the programs and obviously to pharmaceutical development. Now, to Frank and Tim's point, I would like to say another thing about accelerated approval, which is in cancer, and I know that, there's been some concern about that and everything, but if you look at the cancer survival rate in the US over the last decade plus, you see a steady increase in the number of cancer survivors, how long they're surviving their cancer. And this is widely attributed, if you go on the NCI websites, attributed to the new therapeutics that are available. And the vast number of those were approved under accelerated approval. So I would say, with regard to Inspector General's report and everything, people always want to like ding you about something, but you need to look at the results. So like whoever said it, the results for HIV for accelerated approval, the results for cancer with accelerated approval, and we may see the results then for cell and gene therapy for accelerated approvals. So I do think that there need to be voices pushing back, okay? Because the whole point of accelerated approvals, if they were 100% right, it would be no different than regular approvals. And so why would we do it? Okay, we're expecting to get this wrong sometimes, and it isn't a flaw in the program. It is a foreseeable risk that we're willing to take, but to lower the cancer death rate in the United States, to keep people from dying of HIV, to advance, as Frank said, to advance all these fields and get them moving so that we have treatments for these folk. So those are things I just wanted to say. Now, as far as foods, of course, people know, like, I'm a vegetarian, okay, and so forth. So I have my own theories about food, but the FDA Foods Program is highly constrained in its resources and its authorities. So both of those things are highly constrained. Most of the effort is in the field organization, because not only are they supposed to inspect domestic facilities, they're also, which, there are millions of them. I don't know how many. There's really a lot, maybe 250,000 plus assure imports, either by going and inspecting or by certifying that the other countries' oversight is adequate, okay, of farms and all these things all around the world. I mean, this is a gigantic, and then they're supposed to train the state inspectors in the United States, okay, and that was part of FIDASIA. So those are things the field has to do, and then oversee imports as they come in of foods and make sure that they're, proper imports and they don't have any problems with them. So that's much of the foods program. Then we have the gigantic number of additives, food contact substances, all these things, many of which were originally found to be grass in the 60s, 70s. Okay, well, science has gone a long way since then. But each one of those is a huge battle, okay? And who's going to generate the data, reliable data, to show that, say, this additive is an endocrine disruptor? Well, FDA isn't funded to do that, and frankly, industry is not incentivized to do those type of type of data. And yet, the FDA can't simply go against different food substances based on, concern or anecdote. They have to, because it's a big regulatory process. I think, if and I agree with Steve, it is going to be a giant fight. I mean, are people going to rip Twinkies out of the hands of the voters? Or pizza or whatever. But I think that just like we did with the OTC monographs, you would have to change the food removal process and so forth to administrative orders, rather than this prolonged, often formal rulemaking. Okay, that's just a complete nightmare. And don't forget, the food program then much of its role is in contaminations, like infant formula, okay, or all the outbreaks. So they're constantly responding. The field has to do that too, do the investigations, figure out, you know, what farm caused this, right? Possibly, and so forth. Not just bacterial, but other types of contaminations as well. So the job is enormous, and the authorities are pretty minimal, okay? Basically, these food substances plus, you know, any contamination, they can take action, right? But, and maybe some food labels, right? But that's about it, okay? So I think the diet of Americans is a complicated problem that has caused, as Zan well knows, as endocrinologist, it's caused a tremendous cardiometabolic problem with a huge bunch of Americans. Ironically, though, if somebody's against drugging people, okay, the recent weight loss drugs are probably doing more to reverse this than any intervention people have tried to have. But I would say, you know, this is a cultural issue to some extent about what people eat. And it's also, there's a giant agribusiness out there. Look at all the issues about the front of label warnings, okay, where other countries have had those for quite a long time and actually saw, you know, look at the sodium reduction request, okay, for companies where we saw reductions in hypertension in countries where they took these seriously and enacted them, and the companies had to reformulate their high sodium products to get, you know, to have a healthier product. So I think it's doable, but there's giant cultural forces as well as business forces against this. And also there's a lot of sort of pseudoscience swirling around this. You know, I've talked to a lot of people, like when I was acting commissioner, they called me up and they said, it's additives, it's added. I'm not sure it's been nailed down what are, I mean, I think the leading hypothesis is very high caloric density foods that are very easy to consume and cause you to consume more, right? Maybe some of the additives are harmful, but I don't think it's totally clear. But that's what partly ultra processed means, is easy to consume, high caloric density, right? Tasty, have more. So what do you do about that? That's a very interesting question. But you have to, my idea as a doctor is you have to have appropriate diagnosis before you enter onto treatment. So, and if you really can understand the root cause of the problem, then you might be able to take some action against it. So there.
Well, wonderfully said. We could go on forever with all the different subjects you can cover. I'd ask maybe Dave Fox to come in here, and he might pick up on something that you have talked about, or take on, or be kind of the cleanup man on our issues, and then we'll invite the whole panel to jump in and make this a dinner table conversation.
Well, thank you, Zan. And it's been, yeah, just a tour de force, just listening to kind of the sweep of issues that we've covered. I'm going to start just building on the least pun-worthy statement I've ever heard from Tim Franson, which is, what we are doing is right. So I think, you know, that's such an important anchor for all the swirl of activity that
Yeah.
we're ruminating over. And let me just give a little grounding in what we are doing is right. So I usually start off on these Yeow Wows with a review of the prior year. I'm going to abbreviate that, but let me emphasize that last year there were 61 novel approvals of drugs and biologics. Over the last 4 years, prior administration, on average, 60 new approvals per year. 75% on first cycle review, 66% on some form of an accelerated or priority review path, all PDUFA metrics being met, and 68% of the new approvals were new approvals first in the US. So we continue to lead the globe by a long shot in new approvals. That number is hovered around 64, 65. We hit 68%. So that's a reminder, a really important reminder of how metrics driven the work of FDA is, how measurable it is. And I think there will be a lot of pressure on the new administration to be in the same zone, if not to try to improve upon that. But what I don't think anyone can tolerate, the new administration, the bipartisan support that FDA tends to get on the Hill, the public, to see those numbers drop because FDA is understaffed and for various reasons unfocused. So that assessment against the metrics is going to come up very, very quickly on the new administration. There is not a lot of time to waste because before we know it, we'll be getting the 2025 annual report and so on. And then there's the longer term implications of the lag we could start to see if developers are not getting the kind of quality and timely feedback they need from FDA to plan their programs. So we, you know, if you don't address this very soon, the slippage will start to be noticed quickly on the annual basis and then over the long-term basis. It's second, just a reminder of all the various forces in play. So first of all, PDUFA through the end of the 2027 fiscal year, through September 30th, 2026, is locked in. So that's unchangeable. As I said, I mean, FDA can miss those metrics, and then it would be an interesting issue as to how PDUFA would be renegotiated going forward. But I still am reminded of just how much bipartisan support FDA tends to get, and how FDA itself has been, as much as we like to think of it or have experienced it, each of us individually, I'm sure, as some of the most frustratingly stubborn regulators, in individual cases. We also know that FDA has been, an organization that has undergone enormous changes in our lifetimes. I mean, just to go back to Janet, Janet was not a caretaker of the drug and biologic processes. No, she was a change agent. And we know through the PDUFA process itself, every 5 years we get new legislation, and FDA has adapted to that. Not to mention adapting to all the scientific changes. So, I think the agency, to give it credit, is exceedingly good at and experienced at dealing with high pressure, very visible issues with a lot of swirl of social policies, a lot of desperation on the part of families. I mean, you don't get into hotter situations than FDA. And what the agency has done time and again is gathered itself and reminded itself it's about the evidence. Redouble our efforts on focusing on the evidence. Let all the other social forces, they'll play themselves out. And I think that's, if we can focus on that, I think, back to Tim's point, what we're doing is right, and we have the metrics to ground us. I think, we can't control everything, but we can really control and focus on what the agency has been exceptional at, which is focusing on the evidence. The next topic I just wanted to touch on is Make America Healthy Again. I think there is some excitement about now turning our attention to deferring the onset of chronic disease. So a little bit more focus, maybe a lot more focus on well care. We've done a great job on sick care for all the reasons we've talked about, all the wonderful gene therapies, cell therapies, and products that FDA is approving, but very little historically in the approval area for real, true preventive medicine. So Make America Healthy Again is drawing attention to that. I want to point out that I think that's a sort of a backward-looking moniker. As if we were healthy in the past and we've become less healthy. I think maybe in the food area, there's validity to that. But I want to point out that ARPA-H has set as a target in the health span field to increase health span by 20 years, which would make us healthier than we've ever been before. And that's where I'm really interested in focusing. And with Zan's prodding and leadership of me and Thomas and others, we have drafted some model legislation that we're all very, very excited about to create it's more than just a pathway. It's really a categorical shift under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act for recognizing the concept of a health span claim. This would be health span across all product areas that FDA regulates: foods, dietary supplements, devices, and drugs. And this would be to create an evidence-based standard in each category that would allow for evaluation, assessment of evidence in favor of health span. It's not a linguistic solution like Deshea, where it's just carefully picking your language. It's rooted in, I think, in creating a true evidence standard for health span that is calibrated to the issue of risk benefit in a preventive setting as opposed to a acute treatment setting. So we're very excited about that. I think Zan, maybe you'll talk about this a little bit, or Thomas, that we have a program coming up at the end of February to talk about the legislation. As I said, it creates the evidentiary standard across different product categories. It includes incentives. It includes some basis for market protection. I know there's a lot of concern among developers that the types of products that would be developed for health span uses because it would be administered pre-disease, tend to be products and moieties that have been around for a long time. So how do you incentivize development and how do you protect your investment? So we've addressed that in the legislation, and then it includes separately some aspirational monetary prize type approaches for incentivizing and kickstarting development in this area. And as Janet and Frank reminded us, one of the tried and true techniques in this area is to come up with programs that just kickstart the area. And then we know this is an industry that if you give them a target and you give them an incentive, they'll build a business around it, and hopefully we'll all be better off. Last, I just to touch on the rare disease topic and the work that Janet's doing, and I've been so privileged to be able to just be deep in the background, just trying to bring the legal perspective to it. I think that we talk a lot about accelerated approval, and we're talking a lot about super ultra rare disease and how do we solve that problem. And one of the solutions that we tend to gravitate to in this area is some form of conditional approval, is loading up the approval with various forms of conditions. And we may have maxed out our tolerance for that. I think we've learned, it's certainly suitable in some areas where there is a possible clinical study that could be done down the road, but we make the policy decision that we need to get the treatment to patients sooner rather than later. And that's appropriate in some cases, but in the super ultra rare and the ultra rare, there is really no controlled trial down the road. And once you improve the product, you're not going to get people to enroll in a trial. So we have to just confront that and make contact with that problem and stop trying to go back to, well, we'll just kick the can down the road on the trial. We'll load it up with all sorts of conditions. No, I think that's what Janet is trying to teach us. And here I am. I should never try to be a translator for you, Janet. You can speak for yourself. But I think what we're trying to do in that area is recognize the value of other tools other than the controlled trial model. And the idea, I think the real kind of shift that we need is to accept that these tools can generate evidence that we consider to be evidence, that we consider to be substantial evidence. So in a way, and not to quibble, it's not so much about a new pathway for rare disease. It's trying to show that under the concept of substantial evidence, that we can put weight on other forms of evidence and call that efficacy. Substantial evidence of efficacy, not conditioned, not loaded up with all sorts of qualifiers, which tend to drive the reimbursement community in anomalous directions, which confuses patients. This would be a true finding of substantial evidence of effectiveness. It would just put weight on other tools, and I'll let Janet speak to those tools. So we're very excited about that. And I think the workshop is in the works for that. I think February 11th or 12th, but we can certainly share information with people who are interested in that. I saw that come up on the chat.
February 28th. I'll cover it at the end of the webinar.
This is a different workshop, Thomas. This is different than Thrive. This is the
Sorry.
The rare disease. No worry. So last, I'll just say, I'll close with this, and I shared this earlier. So a long time ago, I was in the chief counsel's office at FDA, and we would say that we were unbeatable on unreasonable delay cases, that we had made the best law in the DC circuit on unreasonable delay. And that was kind of a badge of honor of saying, we could withstand any external forces at the agency, and we would move at our own pace. And that's a testament, I think, to one part of FDA. And as I said, FDA does it before. FDA kind of exists in a duality. And on the other hand, I think FDA is exceedingly capable of absorbing change and responding to the new science and new issues on the ground. And one which we haven't talked about enough is AI. And I think Kellyanne talked a lot about AI systems built into products and AI product development, but there's also AI in terms of process. And I think one of the things we're going to see very soon is sponsors doing AI generated submissions to cut down on development time. Right now, it takes about 6 months to go from data lock to an FDA submission. And AI could really, reduce that significantly. And then we can have AI processing on the FDA side of reviews if we can get the budget for it. So we're going to see tremendous change, I think, just in FDA processes, just because of things like AI. And FDA, I am highly confident, will adapt to that. So we have this real, somewhere in between is where FDA exists, between their stubbornness, their ability to block out all the noise, and their ability to adapt to change. And I think that I don't see that changing. And where they stake out that middle ground, I think, what we're doing will continue to be right. So I'm very excited to hear about questions. And thanks as always, Zan and Thomas and Connexum for hosting us.
Well, David, that is a lot. Very eloquent to start off with, and then so many issues to follow. Let's go back to Janet Woodcock, and we'll allow her to take and choose a few issues and interact with the other panelists. So Janet, first, thank you so much for joining us and all your contributions, but come back to some issues you'd like to talk about.
Yeah, well, I heard at the CERC meeting out in San Francisco, I heard that a firm has used AI to prepare their reports. They were worried, of course, so they did parallel human preparation and then did quality control. They were very surprised to find they had to correct the human reports. And it does cut down on the time tremendously. As I said there, though, what I believe is we should stop writing all this deathless prose, both on the submitter side and on the agency side. And I tried to get the agency to stop writing all this stuff with some limited success. Now we have a short summary basis of approval that everybody contributes to. So, but then behind it, they still have 300-page monographs from every single discipline. And that's, I think, a big time waster. It's like high school, you have to show your work, like in algebra, so I think we can trust professionals who've are 9 years after college to probably, do what they're supposed to do. So that's one thing that I think. Now, as far as what Dave was saying about the new additional ways to show substantial evidence, I think for rare diseases, we can still do, in many cases, we can still do a controlled trial. It's not a randomized controlled trial, though. My favorite design is an N of 1, successive N of 1 design, where you enroll people early, you figure out their particular, because these rare diseases are very heterogeneous. What are their quantifiable problems and what's their trajectory? You follow them for quite a bit of time. Once you get your asset into the clinic, maybe you switch them over. Maybe you've had them on open placebo to cut down on the placebo effects. We know from Dr. Kapchuk's work that in fact open placebo works and it has a big placebo effect. And he's published multiple articles on that, which are very compelling. Okay, so, and then you follow those same people, but instead of doing hypothesis testing, which is what the what the randomized, the RCT construct is, you compare before and after successively, and you can keep doing that, okay, until you're convinced that the experts, like the statute says, the experts are convinced one way or another. Have they changed for the better or not? Okay, and I mean, what I want to do is free up people to think about designs and also methods, not non-clinical, whatever methods, animal models, whatever, that will give us a totality evidence that would convince experts. And it doesn't have to be, the statute does not say P less than 0.05. It does not call for a hypothesis test type of a controlled experiment. So there are many other ways to control experiments. There are many other kinds of experiments that can be done. And that's why I say it's a technical problem, because the RCT construct is not correct for these, where you can only enroll 60 people and then you have to p-value of less than 0.05. It's just not going to happen usually, okay? It's just not going to happen, except like if you have a miracle cure, in which case you didn't need to randomize anybody. You don't need a statistician, okay? Right? So why are we doing this? Okay, it's futile and it's causing a tremendous amount of harm, friction between the agency, adverse publicity to everybody. It's not a good situation. So we will work on that. And how will the agency do under my basic concern is that if there is a giant loss of appropriation, that's what I'm worried about, Dave, as far as going on, because if there is a big cut in appropriations, the user fee programs, I had to manage this budget for 20 years and school people on how these things work. Okay, so I'm very aware of it. If you lose the appropriated base, and the drugs programs are very close to that, the drug and biologic, okay, if you lose that, then you can't collect the user fees. You don't have a user fee program anymore. That's how they were set up by Congress. So, but it's very, to Kate's point, the across the board things, it's just very tempting to, okay, we'll just take across the board, make the discretionary budget a lot smaller. Okay, well, you can do that, but there will be unintended consequences that could be extremely severe. So those are the two things I wanted to say, Zan.
Wow. Well, Janet, we thank you for your service. It's just remarkable what you've done over your career. I remember back to the day in the early 90s when you were pivotal in helping us to approve metformin, which, as you recall, was a very controversial approval.
I would like to tell people, I wish I had framed the letter I got from Public Citizen from Sidney Wolf. Okay.
Yeah.
Because he said, if we approved metformin, the world would come to an end. We'd have so many deaths and everything would be terrible and everything. And I didn't save that letter. Of course, we went ahead and approved it anyway.
Well, and we had a strategy, and it was to help Sid Wolf understand what we were doing. And we called him the day we approved the product.
That's right.
And long story short, he sort of laid off, and metformin is now the first line treatment for diabetes. And it's the darling child of the neuroscience community for actually reducing risk of multiple chronic diseases. So you've had a hand in just about every part of FDA, and we can't thank you enough for that. And what a great discussion this has been. We're out of time. I'm feeling very bad that we've not taken questions from the audience as we were intending to do, but we are going to come to a formal close in a moment, and people who can hang on around our virtual podium are welcome to do so. We will hope to provide responses to questions in a moment, but Thomas, well, first let me just thank all the panelists for a terrific show. And we'll just bring the session to a close, but Thomas, give us some last minute instructions.
Thanks, Zan. The discussion and questions and chats have been terrific. Again, all registrants will receive the link to the recording within a day or two. And we do want to mention the next free webinar on February 28th by our not-for-profit Catalyst Institute. Saif, our Zoomista, is flashing the slide now, whose mission is to accelerate the translation of science into public health to preempt chronic diseases and extend healthy longevity. We will be unveiling the draft Thrive Act, proposing clear regulatory pathways, appropriate fit-for-purpose evidentiary standards, as mentioned, and incentives for health span products. So please watch your inbox for details. With that, the formal portion of this event will close, with thanks to the speakers and to you, the audience, for your attendance. Another distinctive feature of our webinars, as Zan mentioned, is that the virtual hall will be left open for some minutes for those speakers and audience who are available to tarry and chat. So thanks very much.